In 1070, a 10-year-old girl in an English village washed her face once that year. Not because she didn't know better, because soap cost more than her family's winter grain. What you're about to see isn't ignorance, it's arithmetic. Medieval filth wasn't a choice, it was an economic sentence. And the price of staying clean? It could kill you faster than the dirt ever would. They knew. That's the part nobody tells you. Medieval villagers understood that filth spread sickness. They watched it happen, season after season, neighbor after neighbor. The knowledge was there. What wasn't there was the wood to boil the water, the lye to make the soap, the hours not already swallowed by survival. Cleanliness in 1070. England wasn't a habit. It was a commodity. And like every commodity, it had a price most people simply couldn't pay. So the question was never about ignorance. It was always about access. Who had it? Who didn't? And what happened to the bodies of the ones who couldn't afford to be clean? So let's price out exactly what that cost. 4 things: water, waste, shelter, food. The 4 corners of staying alive in 1070, each one had a hygiene tax attached to it, a hidden cost paid in labor, fuel, or calories. You couldn't just wash your hands. You had to earn the right. The arithmetic was brutal. A bucket of hot water meant hours of wood gathering. A latrine meant digging through clay with tools you might not own. Even the air inside your home had a price, calculated in smoke and lung damage. So we're going to walk through each one, not as abstractions, as actual costs. The kind you could measure in blisters and hunger, because once you see the numbers, you understand why most people chose differently. Not because they were ignorant, because they were poor. Water, just water, not hot water, not clean water, just water, period. In 1070 England, it didn't flow from a wall. It sat at the bottom of a well, sometimes a quarter-mile from your door. Every drop you wanted, you walked for. Every drop you used, you carried. What no one tells you about a bath, a single bath, not a long soak, not a luxury. Just enough warm water to cover your body once. That required 8 trips to the well. Count them. 8. Back and forth, bucket in hand, over ground that was either frozen or muddy depending on the season. 2 hours of your body, 2 hours you weren't mending, planting, or sleeping, and that's before the fire even enters the calculation. To heat that water, you needed firewood, not a handful of sticks. Enough fuel to bring 8 buckets to temperature. Historians have done this math. That single bath consumed roughly 3 days' worth of cooking fuel. 3 days. Meaning the pot that should have simmered your pottage went cold instead. Meaning your family ate differently that week because you chose to be clean. This is the conspiracy hiding inside every history book that calls medieval people dirty. They weren't indifferent to filth. They were doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic kept coming back wrong. This makes you wonder, if the cost was this high just for water, what happened when people got sick and needed to pay it every single day? But here's the question that should stop you cold. If soap existed, and it did, why didn't peasants simply make it themselves? The answer is what the textbooks bury. Soap requires rendered fat, animal fat, boiled down and skimmed, the same fat your family needed to cook with, the same fat that flavored the thin stew keeping your children from going to bed hungry. You cannot burn it twice. Then you need wood ash. Not just any ash. Concentrated lye ash, produced by burning significant quantities of wood. The wood keeping you alive through an English winter. Every handful of ash you saved for soap was a handful not heating your home. And then there is time, the rendering, the leaching, the mixing, the curing, weeks of careful labor from hands already breaking under field work. The arithmetic, no one tells you. 1 bar of soap carried the caloric cost of 6 meals. 6. For a peasant family living on the edge of subsistence, that was not a trade. That was a sentence. So washing your hands was not a choice available to you the way it is available to the person watching this right now. It was a calculation, and the calculation was always the same. Clean hands or fed children. You already know which one they chose. What you don't know yet is exactly how many of them died for it. Picture the darkest hour before dawn. You are cold. The air bites through the walls of your one-room home. Your children sleep there. Your animals sometimes sleep there. Everything you own exists within arm's reach. And your body is asking something of you. 40 times a year on average, the winter cold demanded this particular negotiation. 40 times you had to make a choice between the warmth of where you lay in the pit outside, dug into frozen earth, maybe 30 feet from your door, maybe less, maybe not far enough. You chose the chamber pot. Of course you did. Anyone would. It was not laziness. It was arithmetic again. The same calculation that governed the soap, the same logic that governed every survival decision in a world with no margin for error. But here's what the chamber pot created. You now had a container of human waste inside your living space. And in the morning, when you emptied it somewhere. Into the street, usually into the ditch, if there was one. Sometimes not far enough from the well that fed your family water. This is where the conspiracy of your circumstances reveals itself fully. The same poverty that made cleanliness impossible also made contamination inevitable. The poor were not dirty because they didn't care. They were trapped in a system that turned every rational decision into a small, compounding catastrophe. And the water. You haven't yet considered what was happening to the water. So let's talk about the other side of that equation. Why filth made perfect sense. You sleep with your animals, not because you've given up, not because you don't know better. Because those animals are the difference between waking up warm and not waking up at all. A cow generates heat. A pig generates heat. Packed into a small timber structure on a January night in England, that living warmth does what firewood cannot always do. It stays. It breathes. It doesn't require you to spend what you don't have. And firewood costs something you feel in your stomach. Cutting it takes time. Buying it takes coin. 2 weeks of food, gone, for the same warmth your animals give you for free. You already know which choice you make. You make it every night. Now the straw. You sleep on it. Your animals sleep on it. They relieve themselves on it. You know it needs replacing. You know it, the way you know the roof leaks and the well runs shallow in August. But replacing straw is 4 days of labor. Time you do not have, because those days belong to the field or the Lord or the season that won't wait. So the straw stays, and it thickens, and the things living in it multiply. This is the conspiracy your circumstances built around you, stone by stone. Every rational decision, sleep warm, save the wood, keep working, deposits another layer of contamination beneath your body while you dream. The filth wasn't ignorance, it was arithmetic. And the arithmetic was always correct. Which brings you to something nobody told you about what was living in that straw. You're eating with your hands again, not because you prefer it, because the alternative doesn't exist. A wooden spoon is 3 days' worth of firewood, carved down. A bowl that's yours alone, that's material your family can't spare. 5 people share the meal and the vessel. So you reach into the communal pot with fingers that touched the plow an hour ago. Fingers that carried night soil to the garden at dawn. Fingers you did not wash because the well is 200 yards away and you'd make 6 trips a day just for hand washing. And nobody, not even the priest, washes that often. The Lord's family has trenchers. Individual plates carved from bread or wood. They have metal spoons that can be cleaned, boiled, reused. You have proximity to strangers' mouths and a calculation happening in real time. The choice was contamination that might kill you or hunger that definitely would. The shared bowl wins every time, not because it's safe, because starvation is safer than nothing, and nothing is what you get if you demand your own spoon. But something's about to enter that calculation, and nobody saw it coming. And here's the thing nobody tells you about what that shared bowl was really measuring: medieval mortality itself. The Lord bathed weekly, he lived to 50. The villager bathed when rain fell on his back. He was dead by 30, and for centuries historians called this a hygiene problem, a knowledge problem, an ignorance problem. It wasn't. You already know that. You've seen the calculations. You've watched the impossible choices stack up one after another. The soap, the fuel, the time, the clean water that costs a day's walk to collect. This was never about what people knew. It was about what people could afford to act on. The Lord didn't have secret knowledge. He had surplus grain and servants and iron pots that could hold boiling water for an hour without cracking. He had time that didn't belong to someone else. He had the one thing that separates the living from the dying in every century, not just this one. Resources. That's it. That's the whole answer. Cleanliness wasn't a virtue in 1070 England. It was a tax. And the people at the bottom were paying that tax with their bodies, their years, their children's lives. So ask yourself, what calculations are you making right now that look like choices but aren't? What's on your back right now? You probably have more than 2 shirts. You probably washed one this week without thinking much about it. You opened a machine, pressed a button, walked away. Now think about the tunic. In 1070, a peasant owned 2 tunics. Maybe that was the ceiling, not the floor. The ceiling. 2 rough wool garments that represented months of someone's labor to produce, and the only barrier between your skin and the cold that wanted to kill you every winter. Washing one of them was a full-day operation. You had to carry water or walk to the river. You needed wood to heat it, and wood cost time you didn't have. You beat the cloth against stone until your arms gave out. You waited for it to dry, which meant you were wearing the other one, which meant that tunic was accumulating everything your body produced while the first one sat damp on a branch somewhere. This is the calculation that nobody talks about. If you washed more often, you wore out the cloth faster. Cloth was worth more than you think. Cloth was almost currency. Destroying your tunic with excessive washing wasn't hygiene. It was financial ruin wearing the shape of cleanliness, so you didn't wash it. Not because you didn't know better, because you knew exactly what you were doing. The question is, what else you're wearing right now that you think you're choosing to keep on? So what did the ruling class actually have access to? Imported twigs, hazel switches shipped from the continent, linen scraps fine enough not to shred your gums. That was tooth cleaning if you could afford it. Most people couldn't. Your teeth rotted where they stood because the alternative cost more than a week of labor. Hair was the same trap wearing a different face. You had a wooden comb. Maybe, if you were lucky. Using it meant spreading lice from one part of your scalp to another, but not using it meant your hair matted into ropes you'd eventually have to cut off. So you combed anyway, redistributing the infestation because matted hair marked you as something lower than poor. This is what poverty looked like on the body itself. Not dirt you could theoretically wash off. Biological decay you couldn't stop. Rotten teeth, lice colonies, hair loss from malnutrition disguised as age. The ruling class didn't have better bodies because they understood hygiene better. They had better bodies because they could afford to maintain them. And here's what nobody wants you asking. How much of what you think is your health is actually just your purchasing power? Now you have the full picture, and the numbers don't lie. 1 year, 1 villager, 1 attempt at basic cleanliness. Soap production, 40 hours of labor minimum between ash leaching and animal fat rendering. Firewood sufficient to heat water weekly. Another 30 hours of gathering and splitting. The time spent hauling that water from the nearest source, if you weren't lucky enough to be close. 26 hours annually. Maintaining the tools, the combs, the linen, the rough woven cloths used for drying. Another 12 hours of repair and replacement work. That's already over 100 hours. And you haven't eaten yet. Because here's the part that closes the trap. Every hour you spend on hygiene is an hour you didn't spend producing food. On serf economics, with a caloric surplus so thin that a single bad harvest meant choosing between seed grain and starvation, you couldn't afford to spend 40% of that surplus on staying clean. Clean was a budget item, and you were already over budget before winter, 180 labor hours. 40% of your caloric margin. That's what separating yourself from biological decay actually cost in 1070 England. The church told you that suffering purified the soul. The nobility told you that your condition reflected your virtue. Neither of them mentioned that cleanliness had a price they never had to pay. You weren't dirty because you didn't care. You were dying because the math never worked in your favor. It was never about ignorance. It was always about who could afford not to be afraid of their own body. She was 12 when she stopped washing her hands before meals, not because no one taught her, because the water cost time, and time cost food, and food was already running out. By 14, the fever had a name: typhus. A disease that travels on lice, and lice travel on bodies that cannot afford to be clean. Here is what the historical record will never say about her. She made every correct decision available to her. Every single one. She calculated the way the poor have always calculated, with a precision that would embarrass economists. She looked at what she had, and she spent it where it kept her alive longest. The hygiene she skipped wasn't ignorance. It was the last item cut from a budget that had no room left. It was rational. It was documented in every price record, every harvest ledger, every wage roll from that century. The arithmetic killed her. Not a lack of knowledge, not a failure of character. The numbers simply never added up to survival. And the people who wrote the history books never had to run those numbers themselves. She died at 14, having made every economically correct choice available to her. The math was just wrong from the beginning. 2 billion people today live that same arithmetic. They know soap exists. They know clean water matters. They just can't afford the math to work out any differently. Subscribe, because economics still decides who gets to live clean and who doesn't. And we're going to show you exactly where that line is drawn today, because the price of survival hasn't stopped being the problem. We just moved it somewhere you don't have to look at it anymore. The numbers still don't add up. They just add up somewhere you've been trained not to look.